Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the Better Together series brought to you by JFF's Postsecondary Network. I'm Jennifer Freeman, Senior Director at JFF, and I thank you for joining us and colleagues from across the country for this session. Before we dive in, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those who are unfamiliar, a land acknowledgement recognizes the history of the land we're on and the indigenous people who lived here and still live here. I am hosting this from my home near Boston, Massachusetts, and my understanding is this is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts nations. I want to encourage you to open the link that is in the chat and that is attached to this map that you're seeing, and you can type in your zip code and it'll give you information about the indigenous people in your location. So we're just going to take a couple minutes to do that and to reflect on what we're learning about those tribes. Great, and I encourage you all to now that you have those tribal names, if you didn't before, do a little bit of research into your location after this session. Now I want to just turn to a couple little items of housekeeping, as you can see on this slide. Later on, we're going to have a lot of opportunity for Q&A in the chat. So please be an active participant of this session. And now, before I turn it over to our panel, I want to tell you a little bit about this series. If we could go to the next slide. So for those of you who joined us for the kickoff session, this might look familiar. This is our shared vision for the future, our shared vision as the Postsecondary Network. We envision a future in which people of all ages can access and benefit from learning opportunities that meet them where they are and prepare them for the future, and lead to economic mobility, supported by an integrated ecosystem of learning, workforce, and community organizations. Now more than ever, an equitable economic mobility requires an ecosystem approach, and that's what we are exploring through this series. This series represents an evolution of JFF's longstanding post-secondary network. Many of you are very familiar, others are not. The PSN dates back to 2004. It's a network that is a vehicle for collaboration and scaling of innovative solutions across the post-secondary landscape. At the core of the PSN are the Student Success Centers. The 16-state Student Success Center network is really a powerful, high-impact source of support for community colleges in those states. And so we really are thrilled that all of the Student Success Center, as many Student Success Center networks as possible, can be joining us today. Whether you're part of that network, the post-secondary network, whether you've been with us for years or whether you're just joining us for the first time, we launched the Better Together series to help all of you to map out strategic partnerships to help you achieve your goals and contribute to the economic mobility of residents across their communities. So today we are exploring Philanthropy, one of the influencers of the ecosystem. And we are so thrilled to have brought this panel together because of what they do to support education, families in need, and strong communities across the country. Our moderator today is Dr. Shara Reed, Director of the Evaluation Roundtable. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Reed.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and welcome again to our webinar. So we want to turn it right over to our wonderful panelists in just a moment. So I'm going to say really briefly who's here, and then to say a little bit about where we are going to focus our energy and attention today. We do intend to have some time for Q&A. So we invite you, as you're listening and you're like, disagree, or +1, leave a shout out in the chat. If you just like Samad's sweatshirt representing Dillard University in New Orleans, Louisiana, you can just say, that is one cool shirt, HBC you love, right? Just shout it out. We want this to be interactive. Again, we'll have some time for Q&A toward the end, but you're welcome to say a word as we go. Post a question, post a shout out, say hello if you see some familiar faces or names among those who are participating. we like to think that we're friends, or just friends that maybe we haven't met yet, all of who's here. So if we can go to the next slide, just to say a little bit more about who our panelists are. And each will have an opportunity to say a little introduction when we get to their work. But we have Stephanie Davison, who's a program officer at the Kresge Foundation based in Michigan. And Stephanie and I worked together for a number of years. Here, she's shared with us the 8 programs and practices that sit inside the foundation. Stephanie represents the Human Services team in her work. Next slide. We have Melissa Luna, who is the executive director of Greenlight Fund in Boston. And Greenlight works across the spectrum from birth, early childhood, all the way through workforce. And she's going to say a bit about her organization and the way that they work in partnership with organizations around the country to bring in more of what's work or what's promising to address the needs of people in communities. So she'll say a little bit more about that as she introduces herself and speaks in a moment. And then third, we have Dr. Samad West Keys from Ascendium Education Group. Ascendium's based in Wisconsin, is a national funding entity that really is focused on learners from low-income backgrounds, people who have been underrepresented. You can read more here on this slide. They have 4 grant-making focus areas, all focused on learners and people moving into the workforce. So Samad will say a bit more about his organization when he speaks. But because we only have a little bit of time and we want to get right to it, to say just a word, today we're going to be talking about, as Jennifer said, equitable economic opportunity. What does it take to get there? What does it take for families to really have family supporting wage jobs? What does workforce have to do with it? What does post-secondary education have to do with it? Who are the other partners, organizations that have something to do with this? We can promise you we're not going to solve it in the next 45 minutes or so, but we do believe that our panelists are going to bring some insights from where they sit in their respective organizations, and that the questions that you all will bring to the table will help us to really make some strides toward answering these really big and thorny questions. And so today we're going to focus on 3 things. We're going to be talking about ecosystems, when going it alone as an institution or organization serves us, when we need to collaborate or partner, to what end. We're going to interrogate power a bit, because we know when we get into collaborative relationships and ask people to partner, power is always in the room, whether it is positional or situational. We're also going to talk a little bit about equity. Anything about philanthropy, and everybody here does. Foundations have been saying, at least for the last 6 months, those who are just coming on board with this, that it's time to talk about race. It's time to talk about social justice. Who are we going to be? Who is philanthropy going to be at this time? We're going to ask our panelists to say a little bit about what they're doing in their respective organizations to advance equity or racial justice. We're going to be asked them a little bit about how they're showing up in their work with partners in nonprofit organizations, respectively. And so just to get us started, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about ecosystems. So first of all, what in the world, when we say ecosystem, what are we talking about? And what does that have to do with seeking out the impact that we really want when it comes to equitable economic opportunity? What does post-secondary education have to do with it? To get us started is going to be Melissa Luna, again, from the Greenlight Fund of Boston. And she's going to say just a little word or 2 more about her organization as well. So I'm going to pass it over, Melissa, to you to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. So a little bit about Greenlight Fund and how we do our work. So we were built or founded on the idea that there are really great ideas that we know work and that we should be supporting and scaling in the nonprofit sector. And so a lot of our work is place-based. So, you know, if you look across our network, we're in several sites, but I lead the Boston team. And so when we think about ecosystems for Greenlight Fund, it really is about the Boston ecosystem. And how are we truly engaging all the players we need to be engaging to address low-income families or the challenges that low-income families and barriers that they face. We recognize that we can't do this work alone. We provide seed funding and help scale these models, but really they're part of this bigger ecosystem and infrastructure that exists in our city. And we're trying to find the right sort of places for them to insert themselves, and so that they can help and improve outcomes for family members, and for, in particular, our latest selection around those who are out of school time or had left high school early and completed high school. And so as we're thinking about this, for us, it is thinking about our grant making process. We take a whole year to select one grantee. And the idea is so that we get a sense of what the landscape is, who are the key actors, and how do we need to be engaging them in true partnerships as we're bringing in what could be seen as a competitor from the outside. And so it takes, we have an advisory council of community members. It's a multi-sector advisory council. It's right now about 50 plus members. And so we're talking about for-profit, nonprofit practitioners. We're talking about people from government, from philanthropy. But the idea is that we know that by bringing together this multi-sector group, we're able to make the best decisions and best investment decisions, as well as figure out how do we best support these new organizations. In addition to this advisory council, we've gone a step further to ensure we have a family partner council. And these are family members with lived experience who are currently accessing our programs that we have brought. But the idea is that we need to hear directly from those participants where they might be using these programs and what will work, what won't work. But I think for us, we're thinking about how is it by bringing a new actor that's going to help supplement this current ecosystem, can we start to influence policy and practice so that we're changing systems for our families? And, this has been some of the evolution of our work. We're not just looking for this one new program, but we're really thinking about how this new program can help be part of a larger ecosystem, a larger structure and infrastructure to help change and improve outcomes. We've done this, I think, about 12 times now in the city of Boston, and our latest selection around Perscolis was really thinking about how can we give people some alternatives to community college or to going to a university, knowing that at times life happens and that we needed some sort of certification program in the tech sector where our jobs were growing here. So, I think for us, when we think about ecosystem, it really is this kind of multi-sector approach. It is about how do we strengthen it to address the issues that we're seeing currently, and then how do we start to think about how all of us together start to influence the policy and practices that are currently making up those systems, and in particular in the post-secondary. That's a little bit about our work. That's a little bit about how we've thought about this work. But also, I think the importance of having the voices of those with lived experiences as part of our process.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. And you're really clear here on the need to hear directly from participants in program. If you heard Melissa, she said a year to bring an organization on board. And you can hear how deliberate and intentional the work is in doing that. So we don't take ecosystem work lightly. I'm hearing you say loud and clear. We're going to hear from Stephanie Davison from Kresge next, and then Samad. And Samad, we're going to also, when you speak, transition a bit to talk a bit about power. So stay tuned and stay on the line to talk about power after you do your initial introduction. But Stephanie, you're up next.
Thanks, Shara. It's funny, when I think about ecosystems, I often think about what outcomes are we trying to achieve. In the introductory slide about Kresge, I partially included our program areas, because in some ways, Kresge itself is its own ecosystem, and we see education and human services and health and whatever else coming together to drive what we need within that ecosystem. For example, on my team, we're very focused on social and economic mobility from one generation to the next. But what a specific community needs really determines what shapes that ecosystem. And what a community needs is really dependent on what the community says they need and what they want. I think about one partner I was talking to this morning from Syracuse, New York, who had just done a series of focus groups to figure out how are the folks who need to re-enter the workforce, what do they really need, and what assets do they bring to the table? that's going to set them up for long-term success. And that really informs what sort of partners you bring into your collaboration.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to pass it over to Samad. You're up next.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. So within this idea of ecosystem, so actually let me backtrack first. As mentioned, I am with Ascendium, and in the slide, we do focus our grant making efforts on four key areas. The first being removing structural barriers, where I serve as program officer with my colleague Sue Choi, senior program officer, and we also have our streamlining transitions portfolio, our expanding higher education and prison portfolio, and our developing rural education and workforce portfolio. And so when we talk about the idea of ecosystems, right, it's really about looking for those sort of intersections between all of these areas. And while we have these four distinct lines that exist within much of our funding, it's about trying to figure out, well, who are those key players and who are those unconventional players that we historically haven't really included in our work, right? And so when we talk about just even an higher education institution as an ecosystem in itself, what role does each individual player play in sort of moving the needle for student success? You'd be surprised how the facilities person on the campus actually has a voice and informs the work that's going on the campus, or how the CFO plays a part in that as well. And so for us, it's really about looking for those areas of synergy that exist between all of our different portfolios and trying to identify who are those people, what role do they play, and how can we move beyond that. I want to echo what my colleague said as well, just around making sure that we also incorporate the voice of those that we're trying to impact. I think much of the work that we do, it sounds great, but if we're sort of leaving out the communities in which we're trying to serve and which we're trying to move the needles on or for, it's a moot point. And so, and much of our work is really sort of just trying to figure out what is that dream team, and understanding that the dream team is going to evolve over time, right? And so it's not to say that an ecosystem is stagnant. It's the idea that an ecosystem will continue to grow. It will continue to change. As one person comes in, the pH will change a little bit more. We need to go ahead and add somebody else in who can help, balance it out. And so I think that that's something that we continue to keep in mind with our work in terms of who should be at the table and why are they at the table and what role do they play. And we also think that when partners are coming to us, they should be asking themselves that same question, right? How are you sort of reaching beyond just the conventional players that you sort of engage with on a day-to-day or a year-to-year to sort of figure out how can you sort of move the needle in a way that you haven't considered in the past or in the recent times.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to talk about power and I wanted to just thread a needle that I heard with Stephanie and Samad, both with an internal example and an external one with the question of ecosystem. So Stephanie just shared with us that Kresge has 8 programs and practices, and increasingly, as it thinks about how it can have the biggest impact as a funder, folks are gathering internally to say, as we hear this question or we hear this need in place, we're looking across our work to consider how we can come together and where it makes sense to come together to address what this community is stating as a need or what it actually could benefit from. Samad, I hear you in the language of dream team, really thinking about pushing the partners, whatever entity, whether they're the facilities person in a university that may have otherwise been overlooked, but whoever is on that dream team, the people that can influence, leverage, move the work are the people that you all want to see involved and proposed for whatever work might be funded by Ascendium. So I think that's a really powerful point about ecosystems and who actually is included. And so now we're going to just move to talk a little bit about power. And so I feel like we would be remiss in all of this if we did not explicitly name that power is involved, again, whether it is situational, whether it is perceived, however it plays out. But to talk about power dynamics and power when we come together, when we seek out collaboration, partnerships. So I want to ask, what have you learned about what it actually takes to hold and to share power? And if you can, say a little bit about what you're learning about how it, as is particularly sitting as a funder, what it takes to be in that space of acknowledging and both wielding and yielding power in your respective work. And Samad, I'm going to ask you to comment first.
In my mind, I'm saying, why, Shira? But no. So I think from a power dynamics perspective, I would say in my role as a funder, I know that it exists, right? However, I think I probably saw it more clearly when I wasn't a funder. And so in my work working with historically Black colleges, universities, and even community colleges while I was at ATD, there was this power dynamic that existed of, okay, well, we're a bigger or more well-resourced organization or university, and for that sake, we should have more say or authority in what's going on. I think in my this is a play on words. I understand in my role as a funder, I now have a different type of power where I can push people to sort of go against that sort of idea. And so I think that that's what I've been able to sort of accomplish in looking for partners and talking to partners about who they should engage with, is really seeking going beyond who they, I guess, typically would engage with, or people who are on their level or not on their level. And so it's really pushing sort of organizations to say, hey, have you considered working with this organization? And they are doing work that aligns with you. And most of the time you hear, oh, I didn't even know about that organization, right? Or I didn't know that organization existed, or I didn't know those types of institutions existed, right? And so I think it's really being an informant. I think knowledge is power, right? As the saying goes. And so I think within this role, it's a matter of sort of sharing knowledge across our different partners and prospective partners about who they can engage with, why they should be engaging with them, to sort of eradicate those barriers that do exist. I think that's the biggest sort of role. And going back to my earlier comment just around unconventional players in this space, I think we have a role as program officers and funders to sort of keep those people on hand, to connect them with those that are the star players within the field and doing this work. And I don't play basketball, so I'm sorry if I keep making these references, but just bear with me. But I think it's our role, right, to really begin to connect the dots a little bit more. And I think through that and leveraging our power, we can sort of, combat the idea of power between organization types, institution types, or whatnot. But I think it's very complicated, right? It's not something that can be easily done. And so I think that we just have to make sure that we're leveraging what we have internally as funders to sort of connect the dots a little bit more.
Excellent, thank you. So I think an important point too, that putting your dollars where your values are, to support more community colleges or smaller nonprofit organizations that are not known for having the largest endowments, but are, as you say, a really important part of the dream team in an ecosystem, is right on. So I wanted to pass it on. I believe Melissa wanted to comment next.
Sure, thanks. So one of the things that we say at Greenlight Fund is that we are a grant-making nonprofit, so we also raise our dollars, and I think that keeps us really humble through the process, because we know and are in it with our grantees also, what that process and what it feels like on the day-to-day basis. But for me, there's several things that we look at when we think about power, and some of it is from the very beginning of our decision making. When we engage family partners and our community engagement partners through our selection and figuring out and deciding what our next organization is, that is an important piece. But we also compensate our family partners for their expertise and know that we want to shift those power dynamics from the very beginning through the process. As we're moving through with potential organizations, we're very clear about what the partnership will look like and how they are actually the ones holding power in some of our work. We need them to succeed so that we're also moving our objectives and our goals forward. And I think that's the part that we often forget within philanthropy, is to really be clear that it is the success of these nonprofits and the work that they're doing on the ground that actually makes us successful in our work. And so being clear with our partners from the very beginning that because of that, we are very much a trust-based, philanthropic organization and grantee centric. So our dollars are general operating. You don't have to, we want you to use the dollars as you think are fit, especially if you've gone through our diligence process. When we make an award, it's actually a negotiation process. We do an engagement agreement where we go back and forth for at least several months about what is feasible, what role will we play, what role will they play, and recognize that it's not just a grant award letter, here we go, but let's really talk about what this partnership looks like over the next 4 years. What can you rely upon us to be doing to help move your work forward? And what is it that we're expecting from you to make that work happen? Lastly, I'll just say, I think it's an important conversation when we don't pick someone through our process also. We spend the time giving them the feedback, helping them think through what their pitch looked like, how can they improve, and often we pick them up again for another consideration for the future. But it's recognizing that they put time and effort into our process, and we should be putting time and effort back into these organizations. And so, just because we picked you, it's great. We're going to outline it and we're going to talk about power, but also let's recognize the work that these organizations who don't get picked put into that, and how can we leverage our power so that we're helping them to continue to grow their power as they're moving forward through this process and feel like true partners in this work.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. And Stephanie, did you want to weigh in on this one?
Sure. One, I so agree with everything Melissa just said. I think I know the dollars from philanthropy act as a form of power, but as she said, we can do nothing, have no impact whatsoever without those grantee partners on the ground. So from my perspective, they hold a lot of power, and there's an opportunity to really shape and think about what we do. And philanthropy often has to question its processes to do this. I think about that. I do that. I recently just shared, we were developing a reporting process. I asked all the grantees to give me feedback on what it was going to look like. And some of them said, no, I don't like this. It should be different. And we changed it because this is how they're going to learn and grow. Same as the negotiating process. We also do calls early on to say what assets and resources besides the dollars can we contribute to making this partnership really work. And I think that sort of sums it up. It's just how are we thinking differently about who holds power and why, and what's the real power to make the change we want.
Excellent. Thank you. Before we go on, I'm going to ask a question. We have one that came into the chat, and I think it's a really good one, and it's about power. And so knowing the processes that you have and what you all just shared about power, one of our participants is asking about adaptation. So you're in an ecosystem. I think Samad, brought the kind of the ecosystem sort of in the biological sense in, right? So, you have a little tear, things change. Fundamentally, it shifts. And this work that we are in is about complex adaptive systems change. So an organization has been funded and oh my goodness, things change. We all know something about things changing because we are here in this virtual setting, whether we mean to be or want to be or not, right? We all know something about that. Can you all talk, or maybe one or two of the panelists want to speak a little bit about adaptation inside ecosystem, and especially given the power dynamics? You're funded to do something in particular. Oh my gosh, something changed. What do you do? Should you talk to the funder about it? Can you make a change? Do you have to keep going with the bullet points that were outlined in the application and what you were funded to do? What do you have to say about that?
So I'll start and say my rule of thumb is just tell. I'm like a parent. I'd rather know from you than to find out from somebody else that things aren't going right, right? And so when it comes to sort of the power dynamic between sort of grantee partners and me as a funder, and I would agree to say that most of my colleagues would take on this as well. We get that things change, and I don't think our goal is to have any sort of grantee partner set up for failure. And so if we have to make sort of pivots and adjustments along the way, we're open to that. Let's discuss that. Let's figure out how it still needs to align, of course, with what it is that we said that we need to do, but we also get that we have to make the necessary changes. to grow, right? And so I think we've been and we continue to be open to making adjustments, and even throughout this pandemic we've had to make adjustments to some of the things that we funded along the way, just to account for the life that we live today, right, that we didn't think we were going to be living today. And so I would say that that's always I guess a key rule of thumb is, let's communicate. We're thought partners in this. While I get that, you might see me as the purse holder, it's really more so a thought partnership that exists between a funder and a grantee partner. And I don't even like to use the words funder versus grantee, right? I usually like we're partners in this. And the advice that I was given when I joined the philanthropy side of the house was be okay with funding something that you can marry yourself to, right? And so I look at all my grantee partners as sort of little marriages or little children, right? And so I think that is very important to sort of think about that. When things change, we get it. Communicate that change to us. We're open to that. I'm not going to speak for Melissa and Stephanie, but they're nodding their heads, so I'll say yes, they are too. But I think that's part of the process. And as you mentioned, Shara, like things will evolve over time and things will change and unexpected things will happen. And so we have to be sure to allow room for pivoting along the way.
Yeah, if I could add on to that a little bit, I think so often before I was at Kresge, I worked at a lot of intermediaries and provided technical assistance. And whenever someone said, "Oh, I don't need any support, I don't need any help," that was always a warning to me that the stuff was going to hit the fan. The ones who were like, "Ooh, I need help, I want to work on this, I want to work on that," those were the ones I was most excited about. And I've kind of taken that over to the philanthropy side. The ones that come to me and say, "We're having this challenge, we need to do it differently," is great. Like I had a boss that used to always say, "Blessed are the flexible, they bend but they don't break." And if the last year has taught us anything, is we need to be flexible. Philanthropy set the rules and we can change the rules to make this work. We're also stewards of the dollars, and to hold you to something that isn't going to work based on changes in the environment is us being bad stewards of the job or of the dollars, and we just need to adapt with you.
I can just add a little, and going into kind of the very transparent, kind of vulnerable space of like, I do recall early on in my job where I was not being a great partner and a great funding partner. And I just remember a grantee telling me, you just don't really appreciate all the things that we've done to get us to this point. And I stopped for a moment and said, well, then tell me. Then clearly I haven't been listening. Tell me again, please. I do, like you saying that to me right now made me realize I'm not living up to what I think should be our standard. And so please tell me. And he outlined a 2-year process to get them to just where they were supposed to be, 3 years ago. And I was just like, you know what, let's restart. We have to restart this conversation now, because I'm going to own up to the fact that I just was not hearing you, was not listening. I hear you now. I do want this partnership to move forward. If you want to move forward with me, let's figure it out. And I do think that was early on in my couple of years at Greenlight that I was just like, this is a real lesson for us also as funders, where sometimes people are telling us or have been trying to, and that we really need to also be checking that we're listening. And, it's a good reminder for us that it is two ways, and that we often take it for granted that we are listening and hearing. And if we're not, please let us know. And we will, hopefully it will sit in, and we expect it to change as things go forward, and in the world we're in particular right now.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Melissa. Thank you for being willing to share your vulnerability about where you've been over the course of your career. I mean, what an important reminder that we all are sitting in the seats that we're sitting in today. And we all, just where we started with ecosystem, we all have a role to play, because we are here. Again, in this event, we're here because we all care about opportunity in this country. We care about education as part of the pathway to opportunity and to family supporting wages. And we care about a more equitable distribution of opportunity. And so wherever we're sitting, we all know that we are learners and that we have a role to play. So thank you again, everyone, for reflecting on power. And the third piece that we want to talk a little bit about, and I think we're there, is about equity. So we're asking about both how it's going with internal equity work, if your organization is doing some work there, and whatever that frame, it might be racial justice, it might be equity, it might be diversity, equity, and inclusion. And how does that show up in the work that you're doing, in your relationships, in your partnerships with nonprofit organizations, with those in the funding ecosystem? What are you seeing, and really how is that going? And I believe Samad was going to start
Okay,
us off
I was
there.
like, was it me? Am I on? Okay. So I think that for us, it's been important for us to be very deliberate about how we approach equity, right, in our work. And so I think the first thing we really want to do is do an assessment of what have we done to move the needle as it relates to equity and racial justice. And so taking an assessment of our previous grant efforts, our current grant efforts to figure out and shape what we can do in the future. Right. And so I think our goal is not to sort of come out with an equity plan done in haste, but it's really just, like I said, be more methodical about how we approach this to make sure that we can have the impact that we desire. And so much of our current work is in developing internal tools that we're using to sort of assess where we are and how we're moving the needle as it relates to equity and racial justice. I would say another thing that's sort of related is the idea that we're in a position to, like I said earlier, to really have our grant partners consider different sorts of organizations and institutions that they work with. And so more recently, I've been having a number of conversations with some of our grantee partners around engaging two-year HBCUs. Who knew those were a thing? Many people didn't, right? And so I think having those conversations allows us to sort of make segue into spaces that we really haven't had in the past. And so I think, once again, doing the internal assessment of where we are, what are we currently doing, what have we done, and where do we want to go is our immediate task. But I think, and within that, we can start and continue to do smaller things that are still as impactful. But I think we really want to make sure that when we move, we're moving with purpose and not just moving for the sake of moving. But now I want to add too, and talking with my colleagues previously, I think we're in a unique space right now that we have to acknowledge as philanthropies, that it's okay for us to now tell our grantees to openly discuss issues of equity and racial justice. And so in the past, when you would do that, your proposal will be looked at as an equity proposal or a racial justice proposal, and sort of sat and put on the side for a certain pot. And so I think we have a job now to let the community, the field, know that we want you to speak more blatantly and openly about issues of equity and racial justice in order to promote those sorts of proposals to come in. I think we can't just say it amongst each other and hope that that will happen, right? And so I'm hoping that you all hear me and saying, if that's what you want to focus on, if that's the focus of a true focus of your proposals or concepts that you want to share with us or discuss with us, share them. Because in the past, we get it. You might have been slapped on the hand for submitting those, but I think we're in a different time and a different space now where those sorts of ideas are openly being accepted from the philanthropic community, and we want you to discuss them with us. We really do. I don't know how to say that any other way, but we really do want you to sort of be more open in discussing and addressing those issues with us as well.
Awesome. So you heard the opening. Awesome. Thank you so much, Samad. And Stephanie, did you want to comment next?
Sure. So I want to maybe go Samad +1, because from my team's perspective, if a prospective partner isn't addressing equity, in race equity in particular, they're probably not even going to be considered. That's just one of our core values, and it's non-negotiable. I would say that while we're seeking to address institutional and systemic racism within systems and make that kind of change, it's really deeply individual. And so it goes into our practice every day in every conversation, how we approach the work. and how it impacts us at so many different levels. One thing that I think has been a change for us in the last year, especially, I'm going to speak from the human services team specifically and not Kresge broadly, is we have a lot of longstanding partners who have started to use the words racial equity and racial justice, but for us, words aren't enough. So we're trying to figure out how, in partnership, do we learn with those folks and kind of get the receipts to really show us what you're doing in this work. We know the words are kind of popular right now, but where's your heart and what are you really trying to move and how are you grounded in that?
I love that. Stephanie said that Kresge's education team, I'm paraphrasing, they need to see the receipts, right?
She said, show me the receipts.
Show me the receipts.
Show me the receipts.
That's even better.
That might be a little harsh, but it's like words only go so far, right?
Yeah, well, receipts, I mean, we want to know, right? Not only that you have a really great development staff person who can speak the language and pick up what's being shared very broadly now. We want to know, what does the work actually look like?
Yep.
Right? We have a couple of folks who are commenting, who are plus wanting, Stephanie, what you said. It's accountability. This is real work. This resonates differently now, given the context that people are awakening to in our country. So thank you for that.
Can I add one small thing with that is when my team was looking at our processes a couple of years ago, we had grantees come in and look at the types of questions we were asking folks and how we did our due diligence. And our current grantees told us that we weren't being hard enough. And they wanted us to do things differently to make sure that we were bringing the right folks to the table. And it changed how we thought about it and how we did some of our processes, which I think fits in with the equity conversation.
Shira, can I add to that? That I think that's also been something that's been top of mind for us, really, is to say if we want to have more equitable or equity amongst the organizations even that we engage, then we really need to sort of look at our processes and make sure that that's conducive, right? We tell institutions to look at their policies and make sure they're conducive to student success. And so we have to also internally look at our policies and practices within our grant making, time frame or scheme to really figure out whether or not they actually align with what we're saying. And so that when we're asked to show the receipts, we can.
Yeah, I would just love to add to that because I think part of, what we've been doing at Greenlight is, aside from the internal conversations and really thinking about who's leading the work on the ground, how are we ensuring that they're representative community? How do we ensure that we have voice through our process? We've also been looking at the fact that, philanthropy and venture, which is kind of our roots, venture philanthropy, is really rooted in this kind of white supremacy sort of narrative. And we've been thinking critically about when we talk about what to scale and what works, we're looking at, do you have an evaluation? Do you have RCTs? And we know the challenges of fundraising organizations, especially those that are led by people of color, and how much harder they have to work to raise those dollars. And so, I think at Greenlight, we're starting to understand kind of our own implicit bias and biases throughout our process. And how do we start to read and change those narratives? How do we start to look at what used to be data? Can we think about data in a different way? Can we think about what scaling and growing might look like and how is that different? We should be looking at different models, different organizations, but then upon us as these funders in this space, what do we need to be doing differently to support these organizations differently so that when they do come, we do select them, they are set up for success in a way that is really, truly possible. We're not picking them and then being like, okay, here's the same amount of money and here's the same supports, cross your fingers, but knowing that we need to do this. And if we're going to do this work well, we have to be intentional about it and also recognize and come to terms with what the decisions we've made in our past and how we're moving deliberately from that and being explicit about that. And so part of it would be, and for anyone on this call who might be interested, we used to be like, you can't apply to us, we'll come find you. Now we're like, you know what, we should be doing more to hear about your work. And there's the mechanisms that we're putting in place so that it's not a we'll come find you, because we know how networks work and the same networks pull out the same things that we've all been hearing and talking about, but that we're finding ways for us to be more proactive, for ways to be listening, and ways so that we can find these newer models, organizations, and find ways to support them so that they can be set up for success, and recognizing our own biases through that process.
Awesome. That is, it's excellent. And the chat is like a flutter. There's a lot of energy here. We have just under 10 minutes left. So I'm going to say the 2 questions that have just come through in the chat, and we can decide how we want to address them. But I want to make sure we get to them. So one question is about those organizations that have been in the game for a while around addressing issues of race and race equity. And they may not have used that language because, as Samad, you said, they knew they would be in the pile for little dollars, where organizations that didn't say it could be considered for bigger dollars. And not to make any organization participating here culpable specifically, but that has happened. So for organizations who've been in the game for a while, but perhaps they have been under-resourced or under-invested, how can they tell their story of the work that they have been doing, given now the growth and the move in the philanthropic sector to name and to really more broadly address issues of race and racial equity? Can you speak to that? So that's one. So been in the game for a while. We didn't call it that. Can we get funding for that? How do you think about that? What do we do? Second question is about success measures with boards and or C-suite executives. When you have misalignment with what success is supposed to look like, and by when, with your board or senior executives in this work, that is complex adaptive systems work, that is ecosystems, that is about addressing power, that needs an equity lens. How are you navigating that? So you can respond to whichever of those questions is really resonating with you, and see where that takes us.
So I'll start, and I'll address the you've been in the game for a bit, and you want to figure out how do you approach this. I guess the most direct advice I can give you is just have a conversation with funders. If it aligns with our strategic funding areas, shoot us an email and talk to us about what it is that you're doing or what you want to do. I think it's not about us knowing that, oh, this organization has always done this and they've been out front, but we want to find, folks that haven't been in this space and want to tackle this work maybe in a different way or just in a different name, right? And so I would say just reach out to us and have a conversation. As I mentioned, our strategic funding areas earlier, if you feel like one of those aligned, if you want to reach out to me directly, I can forward you to one of my colleagues if it falls within some of the other areas. But I would say just have the conversation. I don't think we're holding. We're saying you didn't do it in 1990, so you can't talk about it now. I think the idea is let's have a conversation. We're always looking for new people and new voices to advance this work.
Excellent.
I probably touch on both of those, both questions lightly, but I agree with what Samad just said. And I say that as an organization who ourselves have been going through this kind of evolution. I would say, owning up to kind of where we've been over the past 15 years and thinking about, we started this journey 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, but really what's different now? And I think that's the piece that people are really searching for, that, well, what is different now? What will be different as you move forward? Because that's the questions you really need to be answering, not a why haven't you joined this earlier, but what really is the change you're seeking and why now, and what you're going to do about it intentionally and put the resources behind it. The piece around systems change and aligning with board conversations, only because we've just finished having this conversation with board. First, you'll be surprised that not everybody has the same definition of what it means to be ecosystem or systems change driving or any of those things. So even having that conversation from the beginning around what does it mean to be doing this work, and understanding how you actually scope out some of this work and where you're going to play is an important conversation to have with your board because that's where I find a lot of the misalignment is actually happening. You know, we try to have this conversation and somebody's like, you can't ever solve for racial justice. Like, why are you even doing any of this work? It's like, well, everyone has a role to be playing in this work, and here's what we're doing. I would say the other piece is understanding. So once you get some of that scoping right and the definition right, it's like I think I have found having some experts in the room who actually have done this work moving, whether it's you invite them in or they're on your board, is an important part to that conversation too, because often I think there's a bit of perspective that's missing around how long this work takes, how hard this work could be, how much, you know, even if you put everything right and A plus B, it doesn't actually equal C all the time. And so those would be kind of some of my suggestions around some of this. But I do think even starting from a standard definition and standard conversation around this work and scoping it right is an important piece to it.
Awesome. So it starts with aligning and making sure that we're all actually talking about the same thing and getting clear. I appreciate that. So I'm just going to say the two questions again. We have just a couple of minutes. So one is about telling the story of your work around racial equity when you've been in it for a while, but perhaps your organization, what you've been doing, has been underinvested. How do you connect to the resources to tell that story and to amplify it? And the second question is about navigating work with boards and or C-suite executives on what success is, especially as we're working in complex adaptive systems and bringing an equity lens to our work explicitly. And we have just 2 minutes, so maybe final comment on that.
So, Shira, I'll comment on your first question, which is kind of a tough one, because I also think when organizations are reaching out to us who might not have been in, and hopefully you can hear me, I'm getting some low bandwidth issues. When folks that haven't been in the fold, I think it's to come to us authentically, but also be really clear about needs. I think philanthropy has become more aware in the last year that we need to be giving more general operating grants and thinking about how we resource folks differently. So just having a frank conversation and being authentic about it, I think is really important. To your second question, I'm not a good person to answer it because I sort of lead with what the community and the people we're serving with, their position. And if we lead with what they want and need and clearly communicate that to leadership throughout the process and be clear about it, I think we have success. So my target audience or priorities may be a little different, so maybe I'm not a good person to answer that question.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. And Samad, last comment?
So I too am not in a position to sort of answer the second comment, but I think I would, the second question. But I do think that when it comes to the idea of, once again, sharing the stories of what you may have done in the past that may have been underinvested, excuse me. I really think it's important. I still don't divert from what I said before. Just, making the connection and reaching out to us to share what you may have done and how you are looking to build on that work that may have been underinvested, in the past. And so I think one of the biggest things that I've appreciated thus far in my role as a program officer has been the level of outreach that you get with folks with new ideas that just want to talk to you and pick your brain. And you can, I love to poke some holes, and I love them to poke holes in my theories as well. But I think that that's the part when we talk about an ecosystem, when we talk about, building relationships and breaking down the sort of power dynamics, that's what it's all about. And so while you might think that we're not looking at your organization because you haven't been on the scene or haven't been upfront in addressing these issues, I would beg to differ because I think we're always open to sort of just hearing, once again, new voices from old organizations that have been in the game, but may not have been at the forefront of these particular issues. And we're always willing to make the connections with others in the ecosystem that might be doing this work well, that can actually serve as a great partner to you in this work.
Thank you all. So I'm taking away from this discussion that we covered a lot of ground with this big question about really what it takes to have equitable economic opportunity. You know, we talked about ecosystems, we talked about power, we talked about equity and race explicitly within that. And I'm hearing us say that it takes many heads, it takes many hearts, it takes many hands to make lighter work. And it takes more work with more hands, more heads, and more hearts. And I'm hearing us say, and that is the work. That is wherever we are sitting. That is actually the work that we are in. And so with that, I just say thank you to everyone. If we will, just give a shout in the chat to our panelists and to say thank you for your candor. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your vulnerability with us today. And I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer at JFF, who's going to close us out.
Thanks, Shara. And yeah, thank you all to all of you, all our panelists, Stephanie, Melissa, and Samad, for your wisdom and all of the thoughtfulness and integrity with which you do your work. It was a really great conversation. So I hope that it inspires all of you, our participants, to consider how you approach philanthropy with your ecosystem partners. Now, in just the last couple of minutes we have here, I'd like to share what's coming next with this series and point out how you can engage. Over the next couple of sessions, are going to be showcasing innovative models among partnerships throughout the ecosystem and help you map out partnerships to drive equity and remove barriers to success for the populations that you serve. The next two sessions are going to focus on building partnerships with local and state level actors. So Partnering to Reach All Learners, which is on February 17th, this is really going to focus on the critical post-secondary access points that provide ways to reach and support the success of every student, and especially people historically marginalized by post-secondary systems. All Hands on Deck will focus on partnerships that are essential with employers, the workforce, and others to ensure that post-secondary programs lead to meaningful credentials and meaningful careers. Then, if we can switch to the next slide, at episodes 4, 5, and 6, we're going to zoom back out to the outer circle of the ecosystem to explore a couple other influencers as we did today. So the first is episode 5, which is on federal and state policy. We're going to look at how it supports and how it can harm the equitable education and employment outcomes. We're going to be looking at how federal and state policies influence partnerships and across education and workforce and other stakeholders, and how policies can be changed to better incentivize cross-sector collaboration. Episode 6 focuses on public funding. We're going to investigate multiple state and federal opportunities that you can pursue with partners to leverage additional funding, additional and unusual funding sources. And you'll have an opportunity to engage with funders in that discussion as well. So a reminder about how you can get involved. The ways are varied from listening and learning all the way to planning. We are going to be debuting a planning tool that will let you to kind of work with teams in your organization to work across your ecosystem. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before you sign off, I want to encourage you to open up the survey that Ying, I think, is going to be putting in the chat. The survey it's just a couple questions, and it will really help us make sure that our subsequent sessions really answer questions that are top of mind for you and really help you to forge cross-sector partnerships across your ecosystem. So thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon.